The Arizona Territory in 1883 was a land both beautiful and brutal, a place where the line between survival and surrender was measured not in years but in days without rain. Here the sun didn't rise, it bore down, relentless and judging, turning the red earth to clay and the heart to stone. And it was here, in a forgotten corner miles from any town worth the name, that Elias Mercer made his home, not out of hope, but out of exile. At 52, Elias wasn't so much living as he was enduring. A former Union scout turned rancher, he had carved a life from dust and gunsins. After the war, bringing with him the scars that don't bleed, the kind that live behind the eyes. The neighbors who once visited had stopped coming years ago. Some said he talked to ghosts, others said he stopped talking altogether. Whatever the truth, Elias had long ceased to care. His only companions were a dwindling herd of cattle, a rifle too clean from lack of use, and a well that had soured both in taste and in memory. The drought had stretched into its third year. The grass was long gone, and so were most of the cattle. The sky above seemed to mock him, endless, cloudless, merciless. Each day followed the same rhythm: repair a broken fence, ration feed, lower the bucket into his cracked well, only to retrieve water more mud than drink. Still he kept going, not from stubbornness, but because he didn't know how to stop. That evening, as the heat softened just enough for breath to return to the air, Elias heard something that didn't belong. It was subtle, a soft shuffle like dry cloth brushing against wood, followed by the unmistakable sound of a stifled cough. His hand went to the revolver at his hip, out of habit, not fear. In a land like this, danger came dressed in innocence more often than not. He approached the barn cautiously, the door creaking under the weight of disuse. Inside, the dying light filtered through the slats in golden ribbons, catching on the dust that hung still as a held breath. Behind a stack of hay, something moved. Elias raised his voice, low and sharp, "Come out!" And then he saw them. 3 children, 2 boys and an older girl, huddled together like quail flushed from the brush. The girl, no older than 12, instinctively shielded the younger boys behind her, her frame thin, but unflinching. Their faces were sunburned and wind-chapped, their clothes torn from days of walking, their eyes wary but unbroken. "Please," the girl said. Her voice cracked from thirst. "We'll leave. We just needed a place to sleep." Elias stared, expression unreadable. They were clearly native Apache, he guessed, and that alone could bring trouble. But what he saw wasn't threat, it was hunger. It was the bone-deep weariness of children who had survived something they shouldn't have. Memories rose uninvited. His own children, their laughter swallowed by a Missouri fever that came and went like a ghost. The look in his wife's eyes as she slipped away before the dawn. Pain, long buried, stirred in him like an old injury in the cold. He lowered his gun. "You eaten?" A slight shake of the head. "Then get inside, before the coyotes do." The girl hesitated. So did the boys, but eventually they stepped out of the shadows and into the dusk. Elias led the way, never looking back, but somehow aware of every step they took behind him. That night, for the first time in years, the old adobe house echoed with the sound of life, cautious footsteps, whispers in a foreign tongue, the clink of tin plates. And as Elias sat across from them at the table, something shifted, not in the earth, but in him. The sun had scorched the land for years, but maybe, just maybe, a little mercy could still bloom in the dust. The wind carried no comfort that evening. It whistled across the hard-pan earth like a warning, stirring the mesquite branches and kicking red dust against the siding of Elias Mercer's aging barn. The sun had dipped below the butte, leaving behind streaks of copper and violet, the colors of a desert too proud to die quietly. Elias was headed back from the north paddock boots, scuffing against cracked stone, when he heard a sound that didn't belong. It wasn't loud, but it was there. A dry rustle, a muffled exhale. The kind of noise that didn't come from wind or wood, but from someone trying very hard not to be found. He stopped mid-step, narrowed his eyes, and listened. Another sound followed, this time unmistakable, a child's cough, wet and hoarse. Elias's body tensed, not from fear but from old reflex. His hand drifted instinctively to the Colt holstered at his right hip, not drawn, just resting. He didn't need to see anything to know something or someone had entered his perimeter. There weren't many reasons someone would sneak into a man's barn in a place like this. Desperation, mostly. Or worse, bandits using children as bait, a trick he'd seen once too often during the war. He approached the barn's double doors with slow, deliberate steps, the wood creaking as he pushed one open. The air inside was thick with dust and heat. The last slant of sunlight pierced through the wooden slats, casting long shadows over scattered hay and rusting tools. For a moment all was still. Then something shifted in the back corner, a sudden movement behind a stack of feed sacks. "Come out," Elias said flatly. Not loud, not angry, just a voice sharpened by years of solitude. No response. He took a step forward, boots crunching straw. Then carefully he circled the stack and stopped cold. There, huddled behind the hay, were 3 children. The oldest was a girl, maybe 12 or 13. Her black hair braided and fraying her cheeks, sunburned and streaked with dirt. She stood, arms instinctively spread to shield the 2 boys crouched behind her. One boy looked no older than 8, the other maybe 6. The younger one was trembling, his lips chapped, his eyes too tired to cry. Elias stared. They stared back. Silence bloomed between them, stretched thin by hunger and fear. "We didn't mean no harm," the girl said at last, her English halting but clear. "We were just tired." Elias didn't answer right away. His gaze swept over them, torn moccasins, bruised knees, hollow cheeks. They weren't intruders, they were survivors, but in this land even children could be mistaken for threat, especially when they looked like them. Apache. The thought came uninvited, laced with memories of raids, dead ranchers, burned wagons, and then another memory layered over it, softer, older. His own daughter coughing herself to death in the Missouri night while he stood helpless and wordless beside her. That same rasp, that same look in the eyes, a plea not to be left alone. "How long you been on foot?" Elias asked gruffly. The girl blinked. 3, maybe 4 days. We came from the river, our people got sick. Then soldiers came, they told us to leave." Elias exhaled through his nose, the weight of it heavy. He didn't need the whole story to know the truth. This land was full of forced marches, forgotten treaties, and children made orphans by decisions signed in faraway rooms. "You eaten anything?" She hesitated. "Some berries, 1 rabbit, not much." The youngest boy coughed again, a dry, painful bark that made Elias's throat tighten. The old man looked down at the girl. Her body was rigid with tension, like a bowstring about to snap. She expected to be driven off, maybe worse, but still she didn't flinch. She stood her ground, not for herself, but for them. There was courage in that, and something else he hadn't felt in a long time, recognition. He lowered the hand from his pistol. "Come on," he said, jerking his head toward the house. "Ain't much, but there's food and a fire." The girl didn't move. "I'm not gonna hurt you," Elias added, voice lower now. "But if you stay out here, you won't last the night." Still, she didn't trust him. That was fair. He wouldn't have either. But then the older boy, the one with the cracked lip and stubborn stare, tugged her sleeve. "Lena," he whispered. "I'm cold." She looked at him, then at Elias, then finally nodded. Slowly the children stood, legs unsteady from dehydration. The girl Lena kept herself between Elias and her brothers as they followed him out of the barn. They crossed the yard in silence, the last light of day catching on Elias's battered rifle and the children's shadows stretching long behind them. For the first time in years, Elias felt the space around him shift, like the wind had changed direction, or the land had taken a long, unexpected breath. Inside the house was simple but clean. A pot of beans simmered on the stove and a single oil lamp cast warm light across the table. Elias didn't say much as he filled their bowls. Didn't ask names, didn't offer stories, just fed them and watched. The girl barely ate until both boys were finished. She drank her water in tiny sips. They were cautious, quiet, grateful, without words. And something in Elias, some cracked, calcified piece, began to loosen. That night, he didn't sleep. He sat on the porch with his rifle across his lap, watching stars blink into the vast sky like scattered thoughts. Inside, the children breathed evenly on the floor by the hearth. He didn't know who they were, didn't know what came next, but for the first time in a long while, he was willing to find out. The morning light over Elias Mercer's ranch arrived not in a blaze, but in a hush, as if the desert itself was holding its breath. Long streaks of gold filtered through the slats of the front windows, softening the sharp edges of the adobe home and casting delicate shadows across the plank floor. Elias rose before the sun as always, but this morning felt different. Lighter somehow, not in weight but in meaning. He stepped into the main room and paused. There they were, Lena, Koa, and Toma curled together like kittens near the hearth. Toma had one hand resting on his sister's arm, his tiny mouth open in sleep. Koa's stirred eyes flickering open just as Elias moved past, but the boy said nothing, just watched. In the kitchen, Elias stoked the stove and poured what little remained of his cornmeal into a pot. It wasn't much, but it would do. He broke off a bit of smoked bacon and tossed it into the pan, letting the scent spread through the house like a welcome mat. By the time breakfast was served, corn mush, bacon shards, and a few slices of preserved apple, the children were awake and sitting stiffly at the table. Lena still hadn't taken off her outer wrap, though the morning was already warming. Her hands hovered near the tin plate, unsure. "Go on," Elias said, setting down a chipped mug of hot chicory. "Ain't fancy, but it's hot." Toma dove in first. Koa followed a beat behind. But Lena, she waited. She cut the bacon into thirds. She slid more cornmeal toward her brother's plates. She watched them eat before she dared touch her own. Elias noticed everything. He sat down across from them, his coffee steaming gently between his palms. Silence hung over the table, not uncomfortable but thick like a blanket not yet warmed. After a few moments, he asked the question that had been pressing on him since last night. "Where were y'all headed?" Lena looked up. Her face was wary, but her voice was steady. "North, toward the mountains. There's family in Flagstaff, or maybe just west of it. My mother's brother, we don't know if he's still there." "That's a hell of a walk," Elias said, "especially with little feet." Lena shrugged. "We didn't have a choice." She told him more than slowly, like peeling the husk off corn. How their village had fallen sick during the spring rains. How the elders tried every medicine they knew, boiled sage smoke prayers, bark teas, but the sickness spread like fire. When soldiers arrived, they didn't bring help. They brought orders. The people were told to move, leave the dead, don't gather, don't bury, just go. Even my father, she said, they wouldn't let us bury him. They said the fever would stay in the ground. She didn't cry when she said it. She simply placed the words on the table like stone markers, meant to stay. Elias's jaw tightened. He stirred his coffee but didn't drink. He knew that kind of loss, the kind that robs you of not just people but rituals, the small dignity of farewell. "What was your father's name?" he asked. "Matto 10 Crow," she replied. "He was a healer. Knew how to talk to plants and the stars. People came from other villages to learn from him. Elias gave a quiet nod. Sounds like a man worth knowing. Lena looked surprised at the sincerity in his voice. He was. My mother, too. She made pottery not like the kind you see in stores. She said each piece told a story even before it had a shape. Said the clay already knows what it wants to be. We just help it remember. Elias studied the girl. There was something old in her, not jaded but enduring. Like a tree that had grown sideways to reach the sun, her spirit had adapted to survive. But that came at a cost. You talk like someone twice your age, he said. Lena gave a sad smile. Sometimes the world makes you older before it makes you safe. Koa, now licking the last of the mush from his spoon, leaned in. Mama said we had to take care of each other, even if we didn't know where we were going. Elias's throat tightened. That single sentence cut deeper than a confession. He cleared his throat and stood pretending to refill his mug just to have a reason to turn away. After a moment, he spoke softly. I lost my family, too. Fever took them back in Missouri. My wife, my girl. I came out here to get away from the memories, but they came with me anyway. Lena didn't reply, but her eyes met his across the table. No fear, just shared understanding. They sat for a while longer like that, no rush, no need to fill the silence. The boys eventually slipped down from their chairs and wandered outside to chase lizards along the fence line. Inside, Elias and Lena remained bound, not by blood or culture, but by something deeper, grief made visible and met without shame. Before she left the table, Lena reached for her plate. She paused, then broke what was left of her apple slice and placed it on Elias's napkin. A thank you, she said simply, for seeing us. He nodded, didn't say anything, but in that small gesture he felt something unspoken pass between them, a quiet truth. Mercy given without condition has a way of healing what years of silence never could. And in that moment, the ranch didn't feel quite so empty anymore. The third morning began like the others, with a desert sky the color of split agate, and a silence so complete it felt like part of the soil. Elias Mercer woke before dawn, as he always had, muscles aching from years of work that never gave back what it took. But this time there was a sound in his home he hadn't heard in years. The faint crackle of kindling catching flame and the rustling of small feet trying not to make noise. He stepped into the kitchen and found Lena crouched by the fireplace, gently coaxing embers into life, with a palm fan woven from dry reeds. Her brothers sat close still, wrapped in wool blankets, whispering to one another in a language Elias didn't understand but no longer feared. Lena looked up. I hope it's all right. I wanted to help before you woke. Elias just nodded. Fire looks good. There was no fuss, no need for gratitude. In the rhythm of frontier life, small acts of contribution were a form of belonging, and Elias, though too old to admit it aloud, was beginning to feel something close to grateful. He reached for his battered tin bucket and headed out the door. The well had been a sore point for 3 years now, stubborn, bitter, unpredictable. Some days it yielded only a thick brown sludge. Other days it barely gave enough to drink, much less water the cattle or his dusty vegetable patch. But this morning something felt different. The air was still and yet carried a strange scent, not rain but earth. Wet earth, the kind you smell in the first minute after a storm. Though no storm had come. The children followed him out quietly curious. Koa trailed behind, hopping between cool patches of ground. Toma, smallest of the 3, clutched a wooden spoon he'd refused to put down since breakfast the day before, a new sort of security blanket. You come to see the miracle of bad water, Elias muttered over his shoulder, half in jest. Lena didn't laugh. Instead, she stepped to the edge of the well and placed a hand gently on the stones. "Does it always resist you?" she asked. Elias grunted. "Since the last drought. Was clear for years before that. Now it's just brackish nonsense." She nodded as if that made perfect sense. "My grandfather used to say the water listens, that it remembers not just where it came from, but who draws it." Elias raised an eyebrow. "You think my well's gone sour because it's mad at me?" Lena shrugged, unoffended. "I think sometimes land gets tired of being taken from. My father said kindness makes the ground want to give again." Elias said nothing. He wasn't one for spirit talk or superstition, had seen too much war, too much death to believe in things he couldn't shoot or mend. But still her voice had a weight to it. Not mystical, just true. He lowered the bucket. The familiar creak of the rope sent a ripple of habit through him. He braced for the usual resistance, the sudden heaviness that came from mud-thick water. But this time, the bucket moved easy. No drag, no grit, and when he pulled it back up, the sun caught something he hadn't seen in years. Clarity, the water inside, shimmered like glass, not just less cloudy, not just passable, but clear, sparkling, the way it had looked before everything went wrong. Elias blinked, touched it, then tasted. It was cold, sweet, clean. He looked at Lena, startled. She wasn't surprised. She was smiling. "I told you," she said simply. "Water remembers kindness." Elias scoffed, but not unkindly. "Coincidence, maybe. Wells run in cycles." Lena didn't argue. She just crouched beside the well and whispered something sought not to Elias but to the stones, words in her language. A thank you, perhaps, or a blessing. He lowered the bucket again, drew a second pail, still clear. For a long time none of them spoke. Even the boys were still. The desert usually so loud, and its silence seemed to pause with them. When Elias finally broke the moment, it was with a voice quiet but firm. "Well, guess the land decided to give us another shot." Lena looked at him. "Or maybe you did." They brought the water back to the house, and that afternoon Elias poured a full bucket into the wooden trough beside the corral. The cattle came almost immediately, snorting and lapping it up with long, grateful tongues. Even the old steer, half blind and ornery, seemed to move with more energy. That evening Elias pulled out an old ledger from the cupboard. He hadn't opened it in 2 years. It held crop notes, weather patterns, and small ranch tallies. He flipped to the page marked well output and added a single new entry, clear water. July 17th, first since year 2 of drought, witnessed by 3. Then he scratched something below it he hadn't written anywhere else in the book. No longer alone. As the sky dimmed into rose and violet again, Elias sat on the porch while the children braided grass ropes and sang to one another in low tones. There was no explanation he could offer, not one he would try to give. But the truth was undeniable. Something had shifted. Whether it was the hand of God, the wisdom of old blood, or the mysterious patience of the desert, the well had remembered, or forgiven, or simply responded to something long overdue, kindness given without a reason. And in return, it had given something Elias thought he'd lost forever. Hope. 3 weeks passed like wind through the canyons, quiet, steady, and full of change if you knew where to listen. Since the morning the well ran clear, life on Elias Mercer's ranch had begun to shift in small but unmistakable ways. The land hadn't turned green overnight, but it felt less hostile. The air no longer carried the heavy stillness of loneliness, and the silence that once cloaked the house like a shroud had been replaced by gentle footfalls, soft laughter, and the rustle of 3 children learning how to belong again. Elias hadn't intended to keep them. That wasn't how this started. He had figured they'd rest, heal, then head north in search of family. But the days kept folding into one another, and with each sunrise they dug deeper into his world, not like weeds, but like roots. Lena was the backbone of it all. Sharp-eyed and quick-handed, she took to the daily chores with a competence that both impressed and unsettled Elias. She swept the porch before breakfast, patched the curtain that had been torn for over a year, and even organized his jars of nails and bolts by size without being asked. She never expected praise, but Elias offered it anyway, quietly, awkwardly, and with more emotion than he meant to show. "Girls got more grit than half the cowboys I ever rode with," he muttered one evening as she calmly redirected a runaway calf back into the pen using only a length of rope and a soft whistle. The boys, Koa and Toma, bloomed in different ways. Koa, serious and thoughtful, attached himself to Elias during ranch chores. He asked questions about the wind, about the weight of saddles, about why certain plants wilted in shade, but others didn't. His curiosity was relentless but never annoying. Elias found himself answering, sometimes with words, sometimes just by showing him how things worked. Toma, the youngest, didn't say much, but his way of loving was physical, a small hand slipping into Elias's calloused palm while walking to the barn. A head rested on his thigh during midday breaks. One morning, Elias awoke to find the boy had dragged his own blanket into the old rocker by the fire just to be closer. It was nothing, and it was everything. The ranch itself seemed to respond to the change. The garden, which had barely yielded bitter greens the year before, now pushed up tender beans and squash blossoms. The chickens started laying more. Even the mule, which had refused to be saddled for months, allowed Lena to brush it without a fuss. Still, beneath the gentle rhythm of life, an unspoken truth lingered. The children weren't his, and sooner or later they would go. It was Lena who finally broke the silence one evening after dinner as they sat beneath the eaves watching the sunset burn the mountains orange. "We should start thinking about leaving soon," she said, her voice low but steady. "We can't stay forever." Elias didn't answer at first. He took a long pull from his coffee, though it had already gone cold. The wind tugged lightly at his sleeves. "I reckon you're right," he finally said. She nodded, eyes forward. "I've got some contacts in Flagstaff," Elias added. "A family I knew from back during the war. They run a telegraph station near the southern pass. Might be able to ask around, see if your kin's still out there." "Thank you," Lena whispered. But her voice had faltered, and Elias heard it, the tremble behind the resolve. She was trying to be strong, always strong. Too strong for someone who still braided her brother's hair at night like their mother once had. "What if they're gone?" Koa asked from the doorway where he had been listening all along. "Then we keep looking," Elias said. He paused, then added slowly the words that had been forming in him like storm clouds gathering behind the ribs. "But even if we don't find them, you've got a place here, for as long as you want it." Lena turned. "You mean that?" Elias nodded. "You've turned this place back into something I thought I'd lost. A home." The silence that followed was thick with emotion, the kind that fills up your lungs when there's too much to say. Toma climbed into Elias's lap without a word and laid his head on the old man's shoulder. That night, after the boys had gone to sleep, Lena returned with something she'd kept hidden since the day they arrived. A small bundle wrapped in soft leather. She placed it in Elias's hands. "My mother made this before she passed," she said. "She told me it was for someone who gave us shelter, someone who didn't ask why, who just cared." Inside was a clay figurine, a small hand-sculpted horse with a hollow belly and intricate spirals carved down its sides. Its eyes were shaped like water droplets, its posture strong, unbending. She said it would bring good fortune to wherever it was placed, especially if it stood near a source of water. Elias's throat tightened. "I can't take this," he said, holding it gently like glass. "It's sacred." "She'd want you to have it," Lena said, firm now. "You gave us more than shelter. You gave us back our names, our songs, our laughter." Elias stood at the fireplace long after she had gone to bed, staring at the figurine as the firelight danced across its curves. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring. Maybe they'd find their family, maybe they wouldn't. But what he did know was this: he wasn't just surviving anymore. He was living, and not alone. Out here in a land of red rock and burning skies, a rancher who'd lost everything had planted something new, not in the soil, but in the hearts of 3 children who came to him like whispers in the dark. And together they had grown something rare, a family. The days turned longer, warmer. The dust didn't vanish, it never truly did in Arizona, but it settled just enough to let something softer rise in its place. The ranch, once a monument to grief and grit, had become something new, not polished. Not perfect, but alive. Elias Mercer had stopped counting how many weeks it had been since the children first arrived. Time had loosened its grip. What had begun as a burden he hadn't asked for had become a rhythm he no longer wanted to live without. Chores were shared, meals were laughed over, and silence, once so oppressive in his home, now felt like comfort, a soft space between those who trusted each other enough not to fill every moment with noise. The well had not gone bitter again. If anything, the water had grown sweeter. The garden, once dry and stubborn, was now green with squash beans and tomatoes. The cattle looked healthier, their coats shinier. And Elias, who used to measure success by what didn't die, had started measuring by what grew. He often caught himself watching Lena as she taught her brothers to braid yucca into rope or recited stories from her village by firelight. Her voice was calm, her hands sure, and Elias saw in her something more than resilience. He saw legacy. Koa had taken to carving, shaping scraps of wood into animals and tools with the concentration of someone much older. Toma, once withdrawn and fragile, now revved through the fields with bare feet and a wide, crooked smile. One morning, Elias stood at the fence, coffee in hand, as the children chased a rabbit through the dew-covered pasture. He didn't call to them, just watched. And in that moment, something inside him, something long buried beneath years of grief and war and quiet rage, stirred. Not regret, not longing. Peace. He remembered what Lena had said about her mother's pottery, that the clay already knew what it wanted to become, it just needed gentle hands to shape it. He looked at himself and finally understood. He hadn't been rebuilding a ranch, he'd been reshaping a life. Later that evening, he added something new to the mantle. Next to the clay horse, still untouched, still glowing in firelight, he placed a faded photograph of his wife and daughter. He didn't do it to mourn them. He did it because for the first time in years, their memory felt like part of the story again, not its ending. He turned and saw Lena smiling at the fire, Koa polishing a carving, Toma curled beside the hearth, and Elias Mercer knew with quiet certainty this was home. Not a house, not a fence line, not a name carved into a land deed, but 3 children who'd walked into his life from the wilderness and taught him how to love again. And this time he didn't need a miracle, just water and mercy and the courage to open the door. At its heart, the well that remembers is not just a Western tale of drought and survival. It's a quiet, powerful reminder that redemption often begins with a simple act of mercy. Elias Mercer didn't set out to save anyone. He didn't believe he had anything left to give. And yet, by offering 3 strangers a seat at his table, he unlocked a healing within himself that no amount of solitude could provide. This story shows us that family isn't always found in bloodlines. Sometimes it's found in shared silence. in small gestures, in choosing to care even when it's easier not to. The barren land around Elias hadn't changed. The world outside was still dry, still harsh. But he changed, and in doing so, so did everything else. When we stop asking, what's in it for me, and start asking what's needed here, the well inside us clears, the bitterness lifts, the ground beneath us softens. Kindness doesn't always come back the way we expect, but it always leaves something behind. Sometimes it's a second chance, sometimes it's a legacy. This story is a testament to the quiet power of choosing compassion over fear, of opening the door to someone you don't understand, and of trusting that when we give without expectation, we make space for the very things we thought we'd lost forever: peace, belonging, and the miracle of being needed again. Because in the end, the land remembers kindness. And so do we. If this story stirred something in your heart, if you believe in second chances, chosen family, and the quiet power of kindness, we invite you to subscribe to Frontier Reverie. Here, the spirit of the Old West lives on through stories that heal, haunt, and inspire. Hit that like button, share with someone who needs a little hope today, and tap the bell so you never miss a tale of redemption beneath desert skies.